I feel somewhat daunted speaking here. The last time I was in this particular hall, 4 or 5 years ago, I listened to Julia Kristeva give a totally riveting performance. There's no way I can keep up with that. Anyway, I have 15 minutes and a lot to say, so I'll have to rush. A couple of kind of bullet points right at the outset is my particular interest in academic life is ethics and international relations. And I just want to make the case, state as a bold statement that ethics is not something that a few altruistic people are tempted to do. The ethical constraints that operate on all of us operate at a very, very severe level. They are, for example, here tonight, if you didn't obey the ethical constraints on the practice of holding seminars, you would be not considered a participant, you would be kicked out. And similarly in all social practices, we have to obey the ethics embedded in the practices in which we find ourselves, otherwise we get kicked out. Second bullet point would be to say we're all often tempted to short-circuit the ethical constraints and cheat in the name of self-interest. So just remember that as I go through this paper. Now I'm particularly interested, I'm currently head of the Department of War Studies, and I'm particularly interested in private military companies and this R2P, and I'll get to that at the end. I've got some strong recommendations and warnings to make. We have to consider this topic, R2P, within the context of a global practice within which the global practices within which we are constituted as who we are. We are not sitting, you and I, outside of the international order on which we are commenting. Far from it. All of us here, and everyone everywhere else in the world, are all participants in the global practices that we are busy analyzing. And the two key practices within which we find ourselves are the Society of Sovereign States. All of you are citizens of some or other sovereign state, and together they form a global practice. And also global civil society. Global civil society being that practice within which, in a complicated series of measures of mutual recognition, we recognize one another as the holders of human rights. Now, both of those practices, the Society of Sovereign States and global civil society, have built into them very complex and deep-rooted ethical components. When we are considering how to act in these practices, we must consider the ethical structure as a whole. Ethical responsibilities do not only start when instances of abuse take place, but are very general. So conduct with regard to R2P is not some specialized little domain that we can consider apart from all the rest. We have to consider R2P within the wider architecture of our global practices. Now, as participants in global civil society, we are all concerned to protect human rights. This is a precondition for participating in that society. In civil society, we do a lot of things, including what we're doing here this evening. And a precondition for us doing what we're doing is that we respect one another's rights here. Now, the R2P emerged in the document produced by the International Commission on Intervention and Sovereign Statehood, but the responsibilities it articulates are not something new. In other words, the R2P and the documents in which it is expressed articulate something that was there previously. It didn't invent something new and we're waiting to see whether it will fly. That's a central point of what I want to say, a central point, one of them that I want to make this evening. What the R2P makes clear is an ethical complexity that can arise with regard to the relationship between our participation in the sovereign system of sovereign states and our participation in global civil society. There's a tension there, and R2P comes to play a role in the tension between our participation in these two practices. In the normal course of events, human rights are to be protected by sovereign states, so there's no tension normally. Here in the UK tonight, we expect that our human rights will be protected by the state and the whole apparatus linked to it. Part of what is entailed by state sovereignty within state boundaries is that it demarcates a border within which the state is responsible for the protection of the rights of the people within that border. It is when these rights are not protected by the state in which we find ourselves that the question of intervention arises. And the most problematic kind of question that arises is when the intervention called for or proposed is military intervention. What makes military intervention so particularly tricky is that an intervention can always be interpreted as an aggression, an act of aggression or a form of imperialism by the local people. It can be interpreted as an attack on the human rights and the citizenship rights of the people in that state. Note, it does not matter what our intentions are. We can't, this I think went wrong, what went wrong with Tony Blair. He said of the entry into Libya, my intentions were, as if honorable intentions will do the trick. What matters is how your action can be interpreted by the community as a whole, not what you feel is the right thing. It is very difficult to be an intervening military actor within the territory of another sovereign state and not to fall foul of the non-intervention rule. When you are in another state's territory with your army, it is difficult to escape the charge that you are abusing the citizenship rights of the people there and the human rights of those who get in your way. Simply saying that you are not there as a rights abuser will not do the trick. You can't just say, I'm not intending to abuse rights. The question is, why are you there at all? Pointing to the way you are fighting clearly identified groups who had been abusing rights will go some of the way to justifying your military action. But the difficulty is that the rights abusers against whose activities you directed your military effort, once you're in there and have stopped the rights abusing, they can turn the tables on you and portray you as doing something that is illegitimate, both in global civil society and the society of sovereign states. The primary way in which the intervening power can avoid the charges of wrongful aggression is if it can be shown that the military intervention is being undertaken with the support of the majority of the indigenous population. So if you're intervening in the name of human rights, the primary and the best defense is if the local population in some clear way say to you, we would like this kind of intervention. Now this is very difficult to do. What makes it so is that the circumstances in which this kind of intervention is called for are always circumstances in which the normal mechanisms for demonstrating what the popular will is are usually broken down. In other words, the places where intervention is called for are not democratic states, not states with an advanced party political system, and where it's not easy to demonstrate or prove what the popular will is. However, the task is not impossible. Events such as the Arab Spring demonstrate popular support for a certain direction. And that's really the significance of all these events around the Arab Spring. This kind of support was manifest in Libya. Here it became possible to draw clear links between the will of the people and the rights protection action by the international community, including their military involvement. The initial limitation of international action to providing air cover prevented the international intervention from being interpreted or portrayed as wrongful aggression. Hence, there was this international aversion in this particular case, unlike Afghanistan and Iraq, to putting our boots on the ground in that territory. I need to pause. Mr. Chairman, please give me the 5-minute warning. Thank you. However, what are the rights protectors to do when it becomes apparent that the people, the majority who are seeking to overthrow the rights-abusing regime, do not have the necessary political and military expertise to overturn the abuse of government? So, in the case of Libya, there was the popular uprising against Gaddafi. The air cover flattened Gaddafi's air power and crippled his forces. But the popular uprising didn't have quite the military muscle or expertise to unseat him in an efficient way. So then the question comes, what should the international community do? In Libya, and this is where the private militaries come in Libya what we saw was an ingenious way of getting around this problem. This mechanism that I'm about to describe, though, will, I believe, prove to be enormously problematic in the long run if it is not properly understood. The mechanism involved sending in private military companies to help train the local fighters and to fight alongside them. You don't believe for a moment what you saw on the television each night, which is one or two hoodlums on the back of a pickup truck shooting in the air and grinning wildly, and talking about that as the front line. The actual military operation was far more sophisticated than that, but it wasn't filmed. Who was doing that, of course, were private military companies. These companies were not hired by the great Western powers directly, but seemed to emanate from the state of Qatar. It is the secrecy of these operations that needs to be commented on. They had to be kept secret in order not to drain away the legitimacy enjoyed by the internal uprising. The internal forces had to be seen to be winning their own battles. They have to be seen to be engaged in an exercise of self-determination. So as an aside, just imagine how an overt set of activities by private military companies, paid for by the great Western states, like Britain or the United States, how that would have been interpreted. It would have been an absolute outrage. So the involvement of these companies had to be completely hidden. Now, once the fight has been won, then the newly established legitimate democratic government would be ethically justified in securing the services of these companies to help with security sector reform, training the new military, remodeling civil-military relations, and so on. Now, the difficulty with all of this is, of course, maintaining the link between these PMCs and the legitimate internal voices of the people. The operation of these companies would become ethically suspect in a dramatic way at any point where it could be shown that they were acting in the interests of one faction as opposed to the majority, as opposed to the people. And you can see a whole set of problems one could start talking about there. Now, there are a number of difficulties to be pointed out, and then I would be done. Firstly, these private military companies that get involved in training, in security sector reform, in intelligence operations, in providing the kit and equipment, in arms transportation, in air, all of them are not responsible to any government in the way that, let us say, the British military apparatus is responsible to the British government. They are private companies, and there's no clear responsibility to some elected body, either let's say the British electorate or to the electorate of the people in the country that they're serving, in that case the Libyan one. Secondly, the companies, being entities in civil society, can relocate from one area to another with impunity because they are civil society actors. They're not bound to be located here in Britain. If the British government starts giving them a hard time, they'll shift their headquarters to some other place, and so on. Thirdly, and I've got a lot to say, but I can't say it here tonight, the time is too short, there's no strong regulatory body controlling these private military companies. There is a code of conduct which was signed last year. There is a process to set up a regulatory body, but the regulatory body in the frame at the moment is to be self-regulation by the industry itself. It's like asking the bankers to self-regulate. Now, I think I can say, you know, social scientists can rarely say anything with confidence, but I'm making a couple of assertions to finish that I'm seriously very, very confident about.